Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the final day of discussing the Reconstruction time period. I'm sorry I can't be there today, but hopefully this video will help us to finish the unit strong as we prepare for our test the next time we meet. So if you don't have your notebooks out right now, you should be getting them out. At different times in this video, if students need a little bit more time to write something down or transition, the substitute teacher can always pause the video for students to catch up. So here's our essential question for the day. It's probably not going to be written up on the front board, so please write it down now. The essential question is, why does Reconstruction end, and what was the impact of redemption? So why does Reconstruction end, and what was the impact of redemption? As you're writing this down, you'll remember that Reconstruction is putting the country back together. So far, we've looked at a lot of different plans that people had. We looked at what President Johnson was doing. Remember, he wanted to punish the white Southerners, but also didn't want to help African-American freedmen. We talked about how the radical Republicans wanted to recreate society in the South, and so they forced Southern states to allow African Americans to join the political decision-making process. So they became politicians. They became writers of the state constitutions, and African American leaders were elected into state and local and national government positions, and they helped to try to create a new society. So now we're looking at how all of those plans to put the country back together basically fall apart. And why is that? So the last time we met, we talked about radical Reconstruction. And one of the things that they did is they said that states have to rebuild. They have to remake their laws, remake their constitutions. And a big difference in the states at that point was that most of the leadership positions went to Republicans. A lot of the old Democrats who were in charge, like the old slave owners and Confederate leaders, were not able to vote yet. And so most of the political leaders were Republicans. A big part of that is because African Americans were allowed to vote, most of which were Republicans. The other group of people that I want to talk about are called carpetbaggers. It seems like a weird word. A carpet bag is just a type of a suitcase that they had in the 1800s. And basically think of it as a big fabric soft bag that has like a clasp on the top that you can shut. It's basically what they had for suitcases in the 1800s. And so they call people who move down into the South carpetbaggers. So Northerners who came down in the South are called carpetbaggers. Many of these people are also Republicans, and some came down to help the freedmen. Some came to remake society. Some came to make money off the South. But for whatever reason they came, most were Republicans. And so there's a lot of fighting, or at least animosity, arguing between the Republicans in the South and the Democrats of the South. For instance, these two images show a bad connotation, a bad interpretation of these carpetbaggers. Like this one. This is a famous cartoon, and hint, one you might see later, of what it called carpetbag rule. So you see here's a giant carpet bag, and the carpet bag is on top of this lady. The lady is supposed to represent the solid South, and the solid South is supposed to represent all the southern states, and the carpet bag is on top of her, and you can see it's weighing her down. It's really heavy, and you might also see that she has these chains on her arms, and they're hooked up to the soldiers. Remember, the soldiers are representing the troops who are down in the South. That was part of the Reconstruction Acts. That soldiers would be sent down into the South to make sure they were following the rules. And so, both by being chained up to the soldiers and weighed down by the carpet bag, the South is being hurt, as seen by this lady. The guy riding on top of the carpet bag is supposed to represent the president, President Ulysses S. Grant, who we talked about last time. And if you look in the background, you'll see that the South is represented in a very bad way. Because of the carpetbaggers and because of the soldiers around, there's like buildings are burned down and destroyed. There's soldiers with cannons all over the place. There's even a boat that's sinking. You can zoom in a little bit and see here. So according to the South, they did not like the army down there. They did not like the carpetbaggers coming down to the South. There are some big conflicts between the two sides. And that leads us to our final phase, phase 3, which is called redemption. And here is a definition of that word. Redemption means to get something back that you had once. So in this case, redemption is going to mean the power that white supremacist leaders had in the South. During the Civil War and before it, they had all the political power in the South. After the war ended, for a short time, they lost power. Now they're trying to get it back. Okay, so this is the beginning of phase 3. If you need to, write a big words in your notes, write a thick underline underneath it. This is redemption. Over the last few days doing this unit, we've talked about some really big changes for African American freedmen. We've talked about the 14th Amendment, which gave African Americans citizenship. We talked about the 15th Amendment, which protected voting rights for African Americans. We talked about how African American politicians are building a better society for all Americans. There's dramatic changes happening. But many white Southerners refused to accept these changes. They refused the idea of equal rights going to African Americans. And many are going to try to do anything they can to stop it. Remember, if I'm doing the slides too fast, the sub can always pause the video. You can always raise your hand and ask the sub to go back or hold on for a second. In fact, some white Southerners were so upset that African Americans were part of the political process now that some tried to find out ways to get rid of them. Like in 1868, when Georgia, the state leaders got together and they voted to kick out all 27 African American politicians. They just kicked them out. They didn't do anything wrong. They didn't violate a law. They just kicked them out. And so we see in some ways freedmen are kicked out through voting measures, but we're also going to see that many freedmen are kicked out through violence and intimidation. And the biggest group that is a part of this intimidation is the Ku Klux Klan, which I'm sure you've heard about before, the KKK. Initially in the 1860s and 70s, it's a very unorganized group. but they have pretty much the same goal no matter where you would meet different groups. Their goals are to prevent African Americans from exercising their political rights. They want to destroy the Republican Party. They want to help the wealthy landowners, the former leaders. We don't know exactly how many people the Ku Klux Klan would kill over the next decades. Some estimates think it was close to, if not more than 20,000 murders. And they targeted African Americans, especially those African Americans who are politicians or trying to vote in elections. They targeted carpetbaggers because they knew they most likely voted for Republicans. Here in this drawing, you can see that the KKK and another man representing a similar group, the White League, are holding this skull and crossbones over this family, and it's saying worse than slavery. The Ku Klux Klan was started by this man, Nathan Bedford Forrest. He and others would create this organization to destroy African American political participation. So as we talk about the Ku Klux Klan and the things that happened in this phase of Reconstruction, I think it's important for us to pause for a second and to reflect about our thinking. Because we in a history class, we don't want to avoid talking about historical truths, but we want to make sure that we're able to self-reflect, look at how we're thinking about these tough topics, so we're able to still learn, but also acknowledge our feelings that are coming from learning this material. So as we're going to be reading a primary source in just a minute about the KKK, I want you to be able to self-reflect using the same compass that we have already. When you read this document, do you think you're in the feeling square? You're just feeling mad or upset or disappointed? Are you in the thinking square where you're just trying to think, how is this possible? How is this legal? Are you thinking through it intellectually? Are you in the believing square and going back to what your gut says, how your family raised you? Or are you on the doing phase and looking at racial violence today and what can be done today? So I want you to think to yourself as we read a primary source in just a minute about where you are on this compass. And if you do feel like this is a tough conversation, I'm sorry I can't be there for it today, but I really encourage you to email me, and I'd love to have that conversation with you that we could talk about it more. So right now, the substitute teacher, and after I give these instructions, is going to pause the video, and on Google Classroom, you'll see that there is the post for today, Day 8 materials, and on there is a document called the KKK in the 1870s. In that document, there are two primary sources, a green box and a red box, and both of those are different people who are concerned about the KKK growing in the 1870s. And so the questions that are going to be asked are asking you to find a quote from the document that you can use as evidence. So if the question's asking you why the KKK, or why people might be concerned about the KKK, find a quote from the document and use that as your answer. That's called using a document as evidence, and something that we're going to be doing more in our next unit. Okay, but this is kind of just like a practice for that. So if you'd like to, you can either read the documents on your own or with a partner. If you want to read it with a partner and have one person read the green document and one read the red, that's totally fine. If you have questions about what a word means or what they're trying to explain, make sure you raise your hand, and an adult will help you with that. So the sub can pause the video now, and then they can come back to the video and finish it up for the rest of the hour. So you should have just finished the document about the KKK in the 1870s and seeing how people were concerned about the growth of this organization. The KKK used violence to intimidate people to doing what they wanted. Many times that meant intimidating them to not vote. So that is not a part of the law. It's outside of the law. But white state leaders began passing laws in their states that would prevent African Americans from voting. One example is a literacy test. Okay, literacy just means reading, so it's basically a reading test. And what they would do is they would give a test. It would be timed, and if a question was answered incorrectly, any question was answered incorrectly, a person would fail. The questions were written very confusingly on purpose so that people would fail. And also, it was written in such a way that, well, I guess just to say, the literacy tests were made to make you fail. And remember that education had been denied to African Americans under slavery, and even under Reconstruction. Many places did not have schools for African American children or adults. And so this made it, in many cases, very difficult, if not impossible, for African Americans to vote. Some states created a new law called a poll tax. This said that you either had to own property or pay a special fee. And we knew from last time that we talked that owning property was very expensive. And because African Americans were not paid for their work under slavery, they did not have money to own or buy property. And so that meant they could not vote. If they didn't own property, they could pay a special fee. But also remember, because of sharecropping, many African American workers were in debt and did not have the cash to go and pay for voting. So these are all ways that were done to keep African Americans from voting. Some were outside of the law, like the KKK using violence and intimidation, and some were actually a part of the government and law structure, like the literacy test and the poll tax. These are examples of white supremacy trying to keep power away from African Americans. I mentioned intimidation before. We saw it in that picture there with the guys holding guns against the guy to make him vote the way they want to. If African Americans did vote, and voted for somebody the KKK didn't like, many times it would turn to violence. In some cases, it would turn to lynching. The term lynching is used for when a mob of people, a group of people who are not the police, they're not soldiers, they're just a group of people who illegally execute or kill someone they suspect of criminal behavior. In many cases, it would be um, um, an accusation of rape of a white woman, and this led to many many African Americans being killed. It does not send that person to court and look at evidence to see if they're guilty or not. The group just assumes that they're guilty and kills them. The person is usually tortured and hanged. And then later, murderers are rarely pursued or caught. And it's usually because law enforcement in some southern states and government leaders in those states looked the other way. They didn't care. Like in Meridian, Mississippi, um, 30 freedmen were murdered alongside a white Republican judge. Or the Colfax massacre, where the KKK assaulted a town and people who lived there, African Americans who lived there, with a small cannon. And we don't know exactly how many people died in the Colfax massacre, but estimates think somewhere in the hundreds of people were murdered. In some cases, people were surrendering, asking not to be killed, and they were killed anyway. Now, the national government did step in when the murders are increasing. The government passed a law that basically said the army could go and try to stop the KKK. And the organization actually fell apart for about 40 years. Their numbers got really low, and they didn't have as much power as during Reconstruction. However, when we get to the 1900s, that number would skyrocket. But we'll talk about that when we get to that unit. So you'll remember on our essential question, there was asking about redemption and redeemers. Remember, redemption means to get something back that you once had. We talked about how white supremacist leaders had power during slavery and before and had lost it. Well, in 1872, a law called the Amnesty Act was passed, and it basically said all the former slave owners and leaders of the South, the former Confederates, they don't have any punishment anymore. They won't have voting rights taken away from them. All those secessionists, the people who fought in the South, they can now vote and they can now become politicians. So you have two big factors. One, you have things like literacy tests and poll taxes, intimidation, keeping African Americans from voting. And on the other side, you have those white leaders from the Civil War now gaining power. With these two things, this is basically going to create what they called redeemer governments, where all rights for African Americans are taken away, and equality is no longer a goal. The KKK started attacking people in the middle of the night. Now that southern states were being led by the old white leaders again, they began going after Republican governments in the middle of the day. And by this time, Reconstruction has been going on for about 8 years. The president thinks that the North is just done and ready for Reconstruction to be over. And this is all happening because the Democratic Party, or the Redeemers, are taking over more southern states. So here you can see in this drawing here, these are the redeemers. They represent different groups of people, like the plantation owner in the middle, and they're all stepping on top of the African American man, and you can see he's reaching out with his hand. This looks like a jar or something. It's actually a voting booth. So he is reaching out for the vote that's just out of reach. Now, in 1876, the 10-year anniversary of Reconstruction starting, we have a presidential election, and it's very close between the Democratic candidate, Samuel Tilden, and the Republican candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes. It's so close, there's actually debate over who won the election. They can't decide. So the North and the South get together and they create a compromise, the Compromise of 1877, to figure out what to do. Remember, in a compromise, each side gets something. Here's what the North gets. They get the presidency. Hayes, who is a Republican, will be president. The South gets the end of military reconstruction. So all the soldiers who were down in the South to protect the freedmen, to make sure states were following the law, all those soldiers now have to leave the South and leave them alone. And when those southern states are left alone, Reconstruction ends. We've already seen what happened when there were soldiers. There was the KKK rising to power. There's the Southern Redeemer governments taking out African Americans of politics, literacy tests, poll taxes. And now with the army out of the South, there's no chance for African Americans to gain civil rights anytime soon. So we looked at that cartoon before about the carpet bag weighing down the South. Here we have the sequel to that cartoon, and it's showing what's going on in the South now that Reconstruction is over. You have the president, President Hayes, and you can see he has guns, but he's not using the guns to shoot anybody. The guns are being used for farming. And you can see he's using a plow that says, "Let them alone" policy, or "Leave them alone." He's leaving the South alone to do what they want. And when he does that, he's covering over the carpet bag. He's covering up all the guns and the swords and the bayonet rule. And in the background, you don't see buildings burning or ships sinking. Instead, you have farms that are thriving, selling cotton onto boats. And you even have a white landowner telling an African American worker what to do. According to the illustrator, this is what they wanted in the South. So this is a dramatic change. Reconstruction just kind of ends, and African Americans who had gained rights lost pretty much all of them, and they would not regain them for another 90 years. That's it for this PowerPoint. The rest of the day, you should be working on your study guide. So get out your study guide, fill out the terms using the definitions from the PowerPoints. If you have any questions, just raise your hand and an adult will help you. Thank you. Bye now.